Hello and welcome to another Space Foundation Global Alliance interview. I'm Shelli Brunswick, Chief Operating Officer at Space Foundation. Today, I have the privilege to talk to Roger Spitz, President of Techistential, Global Foresight Strategy and Futures Intelligence, and Chairman of the Disruptive Futures Institute. Roger has 2 decades of leading investment banking and venture capital businesses, advising CEOs, founders, boards, and shareholders, evaluating their competitiveness, strategic investment, and disruptions ahead. He sits on a number of advisory boards of companies, climate councils, VC funds, and academic institutions worldwide. So, Roger, I'm looking forward to an exciting day. We have a lot to talk about, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's so wonderful, Shelli. Thank you for having me on the Space Foundation Global Alliance. And it's an amazing follow-up from when we met a few months ago and the time we spent together in NASA, I think, in Washington. So great to be on your show.
Thank you so much. So just to highlight for our audience at home, Roger and I had the privilege of participating in a NASA's future workshop. So we looked at all the opportunities of where NASA should pursue their endeavors going forward and where should we be over the next 50 years. So it was wonderful meeting Roger and hearing about his exciting insight. And so I knew that you, our audience, would want to hear about this. So thank you, Roger. So I'm going to start with the beginning because you're not really a traditional space person. So could you share a little bit about your background and your journey?
With pleasure. And indeed, I'm not a traditional space person, but I have a bit of accidental space in me. So I started my career and much of my life as an investment banker. So quite a, traditional Wall Street, focusing on mergers and acquisitions, advising on some of the more prominent transactions in technology worldwide. And, these are very interesting jobs. You see a lot of people, you think about strategy, the future, you're dealing with decision makers at the shareholder and C-suite. But I felt over time that the scope that is focused on transactions was more limited than I wished in terms of aligning to my interests. And I also felt that what was keeping my clients up at night, CEOs or the world, in fact, was no longer the more traditional playbook of a growth or strategy or M&A, but something more fundamental in terms of nonlinear change. And we'll talk about that, our complex world, what it means for decisions. And so I went down that rabbit hole and focused very much on areas which I felt were interesting to me: complexity, systems thinking, futures and foresight, while leveraging also on the things I was accustomed to, which was, strategic and decision makers and decision making, and trying to align those with my broad interests, also having a bit of a foot on the academic side. Maybe just to wrap, I mentioned I did accidentally do a little bit of space, is that in my role as an investment banker, I also covered aerospace and defense. And so actually advised, I was in Europe at the time, based in London. I actually advised on half a dozen quite prominent aerospace and defense transactions, including many in satellites and other space segments.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that background. Now, you focus on disruption. So as we see constant change, how do you advise individuals and leaders to make decisions in uncertain times? And we're certainly seeing some uncertain times today.
Yeah, it's a pretty fundamental question, I think, given the times. But I'm going to maybe take it a little bit in an unconventional way, which is to consider that we need to reframe what we call uncertainty. It's really a constant. There are no uncertain times in my book. The only issue is the perception we have and getting comfortable with uncertainty. But the only uncertainty is certainty. And what's happening now is that this becomes more tangible, and the cost of behaving as if we had visibility and as if the world were linear and predictable, the cost of that is going up. So to answer your question, there are different levels of looking at it. I think for me, the first level is to think about what do we mean by uncertainty and how do we slice uncertainty. And actually, I use quite a well-known approach, which is, I think Donald Rumsfeld with the unknown unknowns made it more tangible in one of his talks. But effectively, I look at, what are the known knowns? And for that, we often think about, Michelle Walker's Gray Rhino. What are the unknown unknowns? And here, one of the animals that's often used, or more recently by the Post-Normal Times team, is black jellyfish. And that unknown unknowns is things that you notice, like I think at the time there were jellyfish that were increasing in the ocean because of the temperature rising, the climate change, and that was actually increasing the number of jellyfish, which were getting clogged in a lot of the power, nuclear power, and other boats and infrastructure. And so it's one of those things you know that the jellyfish that are increasing, you don't necessarily know the effect, and it can have sometimes very significant effects. So those are the unknown unknowns. You then have unknown unknowns, which are the black elephants, and then the unknown unknowns, which is, Taleb's black swans. And so when you start to think about making sense of our world and looking at the different levels of uncertainty, one tries to get a better sense of what are the features of what we know or don't know, and how to make sense of that, and what response in terms of the decisions you might make to that.
Fantastic. So you also talk about the cost of business as usual. We all want to just do business as usual. I hear what you're saying, but I'm just getting through this recession, or I'm just getting through the pandemic, or I'm just getting through this. What is the true cost of business as usual?
Yeah, it's an interesting consideration, because business as usual, as the name indicates, should be just what one does as normal course of business. So everyday functioning of a business, decisions we make, strategies, etc. And that I think for much of the past few decades, the cost of business as usual has been okay, quote unquote, for short-term impacts. In other words, from time to time, you'd have a big shock in the 1990s. Maybe it was the Latin American debt crisis. In the 2000s, it was the dot-com bubble. Maybe then there was the 9/11. In 2008, there was the financial crisis. And those were typically environments where, okay, people made business as usual assumptions, then something significant happened. Maybe it had a big impact for a year or two, what have you, and then people got back to normal, the world got back to normal. And I think personally, that has never been the case. The world is more systemic and complex than that. But the cost of relying on assumptions that the business as usual can operate, I think that cost is going through the roof. And I think the reason it's going through the roof, and what do I mean by it? But the reason for thinking about business as usual differently, I think is the way we define and think about disruption. We think of disruption, what we call disruption 3.0. 1.0 is, in a way, Schumpeter. It's creative destruction. It's, after World War I, when economies rebuild. And it's that cycle, which is slightly more institutional, macroeconomic, maybe. And then you have what we call disruption 2.0, which is Clayton Christensen's disruptive innovation, which is extremely important for thinking about change, but it's quite specific cases which are either falling into those rules of disruptive innovation or not. Certain situations do, certain companies don't. But what you're looking at, so Uber, for instance, is just taking a taxi normally that's maybe costing less, but it's the same target audience, the same car. That is not disruptive innovation under those definitions. Netflix was, because it was targeting a different, more niche client or customers, and then moved up. But I think what we see as disruption 3.0 is systemic. In other words, disruption is no longer a singular or recurring event, but it's more fundamental, it's more systemic, it's a constant. And here what happens is that the more unknown variables and the more uncertainty you have, to what we were talking about earlier, there's an inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. And the cost, basically, of the uncertainty is going up because of the knock-on effects. So when everything is interconnected, and you're seeing it today with the impact of geopolitical events like Russia suddenly translating into hyperinflation, into cybersecurity risks, into energy, climate, food, commodity, fertilizer, and nuclear crises. And so these are when things spill over, cascade, when they knock-on effects, next-order implications, you can no longer isolate the individual specific disruptions. And therefore, if you have a framework where you're thinking about business as usual and making those assumptions of the world being stable, linear, and predictable, in an uncertain world, which we live in, and the uncertainty is increasing, what happens is that the cost of those assumptions are going up. And maybe just to wrap, what's paradoxical with that is that you have all these consultants spending time looking for cost savings, trying to make outsourcing or produce things cheaper or hyper optimize. Many of these initiatives around cost savings end up making companies more fragile, actually, because they're less able to be resilient and respond when shocks happen. And so the one cost saving, which is probably the biggest cost saving in the world, would be to reframe assumptions, to make less assumptions about how the past resembles the future, and to reframe and to take a step back on the assumptions we make. And that would be actually the biggest cost savings in the world. So not only is the cost of business as usual going up, but the way the world and businesses are looking at cost savings, they're approaching it in a very specific way, which is making things more fragile, and for which the biggest cost, which is making wrong assumptions about the world and relying on those wrong assumptions, is basically becoming pricier over time.
Absolutely. I think we saw that during COVID and the pandemic. We optimized our supply chains by outsourcing, globalization, and then what happened during COVID is we saw how fragile those supply chains are, and we're still dealing with fragile supply chains because we optimize them. So I think that's a great example of how optimization may make things more fragile when unknown unknowns happen, as you said. So yeah. Excellent.
And actually on that point, it's, there's exactly as you describe, and we've seen it also with the airlines where they've kind of restructured in a certain way and not be able to respond. And then you also see it at a macro level when governments, institutions, for instance, ignored the distinct possibility of pandemics and the preparation for that. So they saved billions. They assumed business as usual, which is, well, typically you only have small Ebolas or whatever in certain regions of the world, which we can just ignore. And let's assume, as we haven't really had any major global pandemics for the past few decades, let's assume that continues. And so they saved billions in terms of preparedness, anticipation, having the appropriate equipment. And those billions of savings cost trillions the minute the world realized that assumption was wrong. So that's also, the COVID has, to your point, many different aspects where you can look at pretty much every kind of organization, institution, or even country, which was a victim to that increasing cost of assuming that business as usual, both preparation before, resilience and mitigation prior, resilience when then things happen.
Absolutely. That's a great example. Now, you talked about it a little earlier in a question when we talked about climate change and jellyfish, but what is your insight on sustainability and climate change?
Yeah, it's obviously it's one of the biggest existential concerns there is, because the scope of the risk on climate is potentially irreversible. So it defies other risks where you can maybe get away from it or just do something to mitigate. You reach a point where there could be a point of no return. So it's very serious, and my concern is really how the world is thinking about it or not thinking about it enough. And because a lot of what you see on the news flow is greenwashing or PR or looking at point solutions for other ulterior motives as opposed to something more fundamental. So I think there are a number of aspects which we should we try to think about when we work on the climate foresight at our end, and I work, with a number of organizations. One is, beyond the mitigation, what does society, countries, cities, businesses do to become resilient and to adapt? I think we actually work a lot with a company. I'm on the Climate Intelligence Council called Servist, which focuses on understanding at an asset level what is the potential impact of climate change, and to incorporate that in decision making in a systemic way. So for me, one of the important things is, beyond policy and the strategy of individual companies, is actually having the intelligence of what the world's asset, and by asset I'm using it in the broadest possible sense. For a company with hotels, it means the infrastructure. For cities, it means the buildings, the roads, the streets. On the infrastructure level, it means power plants. For technology to connect and for us to have this conversation, it means servers and clouds. What is the impact on that? We saw some glitches during the summer in Europe with Google and others. What happens when we're not looking after at an asset and infrastructure level? And so for me, the one of the key aspects at a business and strategic level of climate is really this concept of understanding how to integrate climate in everyday decision making for physical climate risk around resilience and adapting cities, organizations, businesses, infrastructure, communications, technology to climate. I just want to share one or two anecdotes on the kind of more partly academic or kind of, taking a different approach from just business strategy or policy, which, we spend a lot of time on, which is, I had the opportunity a few months ago to attend a very fascinating talk by Kim Stanley Robinson around his recent book, Ministry of the Future. It was organized by the Long Now Foundations in San Francisco. And one of the points Kim Stanley, and the book, The Ministry of the Future, is what we call climate fiction. In other words, it's fiction, it's science fiction, but it's really based on current existing science, and the timeframes are not necessarily that far away. But when he wrote the book in 2019, he was telling us during his talk, he was envisaging events of 20 or 30 years ahead. 2019 is not long ago, it's 3 years ago. And what he was telling us, which was quite shocking a few months back, is that he now, with additional evidence and science and events over the past 3 years, would consider that what he foresaw as the next 20 or 30 years, he's giving it a time frame of a decade. And in the futurist community, which is one of my hats, is there's a very interesting debate going on, and one by one of the most well-known futurists called Richard Slaughter, who wrote a paper called Farewell Alternative Futures. And in that, he's kind of challenging the approach for futures by saying, well, we always think about, foresight and future studies in terms of alternative futures. What are the preferable futures we want? And with the idea that if we think about them, anticipate them, imagine them, we have the agency to drive the futures we want, including our preferred futures. And the notion he introduces is whether the whole concept of imagining preferable alternative futures, which do not directly address climate change, basically is impossible. In other words, it's like the elephant in the room. If you are not dealing with the biggest existential threat, which is becoming more and more imminent, how can you possibly be thinking of preferred futures if you're not integrating how to address that? And that really brings you to thinking about what is effective change in our systemic world. How do you affect real change? And where I get a bit scared, or a lot scared, is when you think about movies like Don't Look Up, which are not fiction. Movies like Don't Look Up are really pointing towards the biggest complexities for society and decision making, I think. And this is, it's a little bit of a long answer to your question, but I think it's important because one of the things I try and do in my work in climate foresight is trying to address what are the drivers of the Don't Look Up syndrome and what is happening to society, policy, and decision makers. And I think the first aspect is that unless we have 100% certainty on things, however big the disaster, people aren't willing to nudge, neither companies nor governments or anything. We saw it with COVID. Until it was there on the doorstep and too late, no one did anything. And so there's an issue of mobilization in a complex world, which is not obvious to articulate in simple ways the solutions for things or even what the problems are. It's difficult to get 100% certainty in terms of precisely what's happening, exactly the impacts, and precisely what needs to be done. And then you add to that, of course, politicization, you add to that the polarization of society, you add to that the features of who's manipulating the polarization and what are the interests, including of big organizations, the cock industries and others who intentionally are trying to play with this polarization and to orient the policy at a political level. So when you put all this together, there's a lot of work, I think, for whether it's your organizations or many others who think more systemically, who think about longer time horizons, who think about the role of society and humanity in broader context.
That's excellent, and thank you for sharing that. It really highlights, sustainability and climate change and all of it together. And I recently heard from Bill Gates where he made a comment that we really need innovation to help solve some of the climate change and sustainability. Yeah. So how do you think we can push the envelope of innovation, whether it's for sustainability, space exploration, Web3, or anything else?
Yeah, it's directly linked, and maybe just a slight preamble to the question on the role of innovation in climate. One additional consideration, and we'll come to innovation in a second, but is understanding that distinction between point solutions, which may be clever technologies or clever app or enterprise software or something which can almost operate slightly standalone and self-contained. And the challenge with innovation specifically for climate, and also the opportunity, because when we use the word challenge or disruption, we actually consider them to be neutral and to be opening the door to opportunities from many aspects, innovation, creativity, business opportunities. But the distinction between point solutions and something systemic solutions is that because of the different time horizons, the number of different stakeholders, the policymakers, and the different type of financing, when you're looking at innovating around climate, you really need something which can scale in complex real-world environments, interacting with all the different aspects of it. And that's where that consideration is one of the most important ones to innovation. And so if you take, for instance, autonomous driving, if you take, for instance, electric vehicles, all these aspects, it's not just a question of scaling and having enough of the resources or the commodities that are required, and even that is a challenge, but it's also how does it integrate then with the infrastructure and everything else. Having made that caveat aside, but I think it's an important one when we're thinking about innovation in the context of climate as opposed to innovation more broadly. But coming back, Shelli, to your question on innovation per se, I think the starting point for me is to make that distinction, and I know we often use innovation in the sense of invention, but to make the distinction between innovation and invention. In other words, innovation, we're looking at sustaining and exploiting something that exists. We're looking at understanding certain features and technologies and evolving incrementally with what we know. So those are within the boundaries of what exists, within the boundaries of convention. I think when we're looking at discontinuous innovation, i.e. invention, there you're looking at unknowns, you're looking at exploring, you're looking at what if, at something where there are no references. And that's where I think the approach is different and it's much harder, but the opportunities are much greater. I think there's in fact, one of the best examples I have is in space, right? When you have, beyond the importance of failure and innovation going hand in hand and all that, you have basically, to our discussion earlier around assumptions and relying on assumptions and the cost of relying on assumptions. there's basically the need to ditch these hard-held assumptions. And one great example I find is really using first principles, and first principles, which was Elon Musk, when he looked hard and close at the price of scaling and how to build innovative, rockets. He looked at Boeing and Airbus and saw that the cost of putting together a rocket in terms of materials and all that is probably less than 5% of the total cost. And it's only by adopting first principles and starting from basics that he realized that actually you can commercialize and scale and innovate in space beyond what NASA and Airbus and Boeing or others had been doing for decades. And I think it's that idea where you are really taking a blank page and asking what if, where you're really looking at a different perspective in the world. You're embracing the challenge. You're happy to take the risk and to fail. You're open to different possibilities and optionalities, completely dropping everything that are the references in that. And then last but not least, I would say, and this comes back again to fragility and anti-fragility with Nassim Taleb, which is alignment and skin in the game. A lot of the organizations or individuals don't always have the same degree of skin in the game. And therefore, it's sometimes more difficult to really take a more fundamental approach, a more systemic approach beyond the quick, easy win. And I mean, even for venture capitalists or founders, not everybody has real skin in the game in terms of the longer term. Many of them are thinking about short-term opportunities and making quick buck or quick IPO. And so that degree of alignment, which is broader perspective, longer time horizons, is also very important, I personally think, to innovation.
Fantastic. I think that's really helpful to understand those differences, as you said, between innovation and invention. So that's fantastic. Now I'm going to pivot because this is the Space Foundation. We're going to talk a little bit about space. What are your thoughts about the space industry and how do we prepare to scale and commercialize it?
Yeah. So let's start with the scaling. I think the example we gave earlier on Elon Musk is a good one, as well as the considerations around systemic fundamental solutions versus point solutions. When you're looking at the complexities of space to a degree, as with climate, you're looking at clearly different time horizons, different interactions with ecosystems. You're looking at infrastructure considerations, policy. You're looking at all kinds of things which go beyond just point solutions. And so to scale there, again, it's first principles has existed for forever, since the Greek philosophers, if not before. And when Henry Ford thought about moving assembly lines from producing X cars and doing probably 10 hours per car to being able to produce a car in 1 hour or what have you, he really broke down the car and the considerations into the most basic constituents. And Elon Musk, and again, I'm not necessarily, although he is a fellow South African and a very intriguing character, I'm not necessarily, I'm neutral with Elon Musk. Don't have a particular vested interest, but I think, one has to really think about, why is it that someone from the outside, what approach did he take in terms of first principles to realize and to achieve scalability beyond what the Airbus and Boeing does? And a lot of it boils down, again, to what assumptions organizations are making about the world and to how they approach, solutions and invention. So that's the scaling side. In terms of the thoughts on space, it's a wonderful sector and aspect just in terms of the imagination and science and so many aspects. And so there's a whole wealth of aspects to consider there. From also my particular vantage point in terms of the work I focus on, it's a very significant driver of disruption. And so we spend some time focusing on space amongst many other things in our work. And again, disruption, we use it in a neutral way. It's not necessarily positive or negative. It depends how you think about it, what assumptions you make about the world, how you prepare for disruption, and how you respond to it. So disruption per se is not positive or negative. It's as much as an opportunity or risk. But in our 5 major drivers of disruption at the Institute, we consider one to be new frontiers, geopolitical, global, and economic reshuffling. And as part of that, you can see the competition with different jurisdictions and countries like China who are intent on achieving autonomy in some of these critical sectors, whether it's quantum, AI, and space is part of that. And some amazing achievements and milestones for the US and many other countries, including the UAE, but also China in terms of the number of moon landings recently, landing on Mars, the low orbit space stations, and the like. So there's a lot going on in terms of geopolitical and potential for disruption. In terms of the more business and strategic side, I'm seeing space which is becoming more of a theme than a place, so to say. And so, as wearing my venture capital hat, you can see that today space has the promise of financial returns. In other words, what happens with a lot of these kind of exploration-based industries is that it starts with the governments. They fund the initial phases that can last decades. And then you have public-private partnerships which take over. And I think now it's starting to move. There's an inflection point towards beyond the billionaires and the governments and large corporates. There are many different institutions, companies, funds, which are looking at more kind of conventional financial returns. So that shows a maturity, I think, of the potential size, importance, and inflection points. There's a second element to it beyond the sort of investment side, which is the infrastructure and the industries. I think that if you think about some of the biggest challenges around transportation and energy and manufacturing, there's a lot which is driving innovation and which is requiring investment. And a lot of these are also very important for planet Earth as well. I mean, there's no disconnect, right? Everything is systemic and connected. If we find different energy supplies or energy sources, if we find different ways of for transportation, there are many innovations that can be helpful, and there are many that can be also detrimental. Again, you have the duality. Things also have an impact. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we steer these innovations and explorations towards areas which are sustainable and not damaging. So that's the second aspect after the financial one, is really the infrastructure and industries. There's a lot of opportunities for established companies, new ideas. And the final one is really just thinking about opportunities and employment. When you look at the future of the world and work, what does it mean if space becomes habitable? And it's not just jobs in space. How many lawyers, how many ad agencies, how many manufacturers, engineers, ethics? We were at our session a few months back, Shelli, in NASA. We had our colleague who was a space anthropologist. So how many professions and opportunities are there that are related to space? And then my final wrap-up point on space is to link it also to why I believe that we need to think about uncertainty differently. Because if you think about whether the world or not, whether space will scale over the next few 5, 10, 20, or 30 years, whether we might live in space, those kind of considerations have an impact on most aspects of life, business, and institutions. And so coming back to the premise, which is disruption is a constant and systemic change is the only certainty, think about how essential it is for us to integrate an understanding of how space might evolve. I hope that gives you some elements. But anyway, as an aside, I'm a huge fan and think only positively. But like all aspects of where the stakes are high, there's a lot going on, and for humanity to make sure we get things right.
Absolutely. I think that was fantastic and really some good insight on where we're going in the space industry. So we're going to take a short break for some great insight on what's happening at Space Foundation.
The Space Foundation Discovery Center, where engaging interactive exhibits tell the story of space and its importance to everyday life, all in a safe, clean, and fun environment. Make new discoveries together at the Space Foundation Discovery Center, Colorado Springs.
Well, welcome back to our Global Alliance interview with Roger Spitz, President of Techistential, Global Foresight, Strategy and Futures Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Disruptive Futures Institute. Well, Roger, we've had an exciting first half, so I know it's only going to get better from here. But I'm going to start with, what is Techistential? And I mean, first of all, how did you create that amazing terminology?
Thanks, Shelli. Yeah, so the two areas I spend most of my time on today, one is the Institute, the Disruptive Futures Institute, which is more educational. And Techistential is a foresight practice. So foresight is really trying to think about, longer time horizons, thinking about how to develop scenarios around possibilities, how to make decisions in uncertainty, and how to work on some of the problems in a systemic way when you're thinking about AI or any change. How do you think about the next order implications? How do you try and anticipate the things you should be on AI ethics? The existential risk we talked about. How does it all connect? So we spend a lot of time with clients where we're just really trying to connect the shifting dots for things that may not seem obvious, picking up signals as to how things might change, which seem maybe anecdotal early on, but how they might change over time. What are the next order implications of these change? How do they all connect? And that allows preparation and anticipation of things we should maybe be paying more attention to. Discovery of opportunities, because as you think about these, maybe other people who are just thinking about the linear world or not. And the most valuable aspect for me is really impactful systemic change. So topics like education, topics like climate, topics like fairness, equity. How do we think about affecting change in something as complex as our society? The anecdote on the name, thanks for picking that up. So Techistential is basically technology and existential. And I've been forever a huge fan of philosophy. One of the reasons I decided to move to the next phase of my life, focusing less on day-to-day transactions and investment banking, is because I wanted to reconcile with some of my early interests. And one of the things about foresight is that it's multidisciplinary. It really covers absolutely everything. And so I'm able to revisit philosophy in a way which I find interesting, including with a colleague who's PhD and done theses on Kant and other things. But my interest in existential philosophy is really to do with the fact that the future is precisely unknown and unknowable and unpredictable. And that is actually a great thing. You exist and then create your essence. So to use Jean-Paul Sartre's concepts of existential philosophy, you exist and then create yourself. But that means you have agency. That means that you have freedom and choice. And so that's really what I'm playing with Techistential. It's ultimately that this uncertainty and disruption and change, not only is it a constant, but that it's actually not only is it okay that it's a constant and that you can get comfortable with that, but it's actually what allows you to have agency, to have freedom and choice. And so it's an extremely positive thing because you can create whatever you want. To our earlier discussion, what is invention versus innovation? It applies to human beings as well. That agency, freedom, and choice simply means that because of this uncertainty and unpredictability, things are not predetermined. And so anyway, that's the kind of backstory, as you ask.
I think that's amazing. I'm sure many of our audience members are wondering about that. So in our first half, we talked about the workforce and you shared about, opportunities in employment in the space industry. And here at Space Foundation, one of the things we're really passionate about is our Center for Innovation and Education. And it's about creating that lifelong learning, that workforce pipeline from, preschool, into primary, middle, and high school, teaching teachers, entrepreneurial facilitation. So what do you see driving the workforce of today, and where do you see the workforce of the future going?
Yeah. The work you're doing, Shelli, around those topics is really couldn't be more important. And, thanks for bringing these topics up, because we've spoken about quite a few things so far, half an hour, 40 minutes together. But this is really important, which is, how do you think about education? How do you think about remaining not just economically relevant, but also what are the areas of interest? And to the discussion earlier around Techistential, which is technology and existential, how do we think about human existence and decision-making in a technological world? Because unlike the existential philosophers of the 20th century, humans pretty much had a exclusivity on decision-making. What does that look like in the 21st century, where humans don't necessarily have exclusivity on decision-making? So I think about change. I like to think about one of Jim Dator's, one of the most famous futurists, and he talks about, when thinking about the future, you're thinking about things that existed and that will no longer exist tomorrow, things that have not existed and that might exist tomorrow. But there's a third piece, which is things that have existed and that will continue to exist. And so I like to think about constants. What are the things we can pretty much consider to be constants? And those orient how to think about life in terms of remaining economically relevant, and with that, the education that allows one to stay economically relevant. So the first aspect, which I think is a constant, and which really, in terms of thinking about the future, we really should integrate, which is that anything that can be automated, cognified, decentralized, digitized, disintermediated, or virtualized will be. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's quite a few words in that, but it's important, because the fact that you can automate, decentralize, digitize, disintermediate, virtualize, cognify anything pretty much, or that whatever can be will be, it transforms pretty much every aspect of the economy, including industries, sectors, professions, jobs, the meaning of work, and what education should be. So that's one aspect which I think is very important. And the other things that most likely will be constants are longevity, continuation of hyperconnectivity between objects, people and objects, people and people, many different aspects, and automation. So once you put all that together, we can then tie in also with some of the more fundamental drivers of change. So you talked about space. There are many opportunities in space we might not be thinking about, including that don't involve physically being in space, or that don't require waiting for the milestones of space to be fully commercialized. There are probably thousands, tens of thousands, you probably have the data, of jobs that are space related already today. Then we talked about some of the biggest existential risks facing humanity, sustainability oriented. So when you think about sustainability, when we think about it systemically, it affects pretty much every way a company operates, operations, decisions are made, policies should be made. So sustainability, beyond the obvious and the PR, I'm hoping will be basically the fundamentals of pretty much every business and activity. And then when you think about other drivers of disruption, like AI, you're looking not only just at engineers, but you're looking at fairness and ethics and ethical questions and existential questions and data exploitation and many aspects which require backgrounds which are broad and which understand different vantage points, including philosophy and ethics. So to wrap, what does it mean when you integrate those as constants? I think it means you got to be flexible, imaginative, and have critical thinking. Think about the examples we talked about with first principles. Change is a constant. Disruption is a constant. So you're thinking about skills in life as a portfolio. And in fact, to share a personal anecdote, one of the reasons I decided and forced myself to move from investment banking, I'd been doing M&A for 20 years. I think I was doing an okay job. And I think if I wanted to stay in investment banking or M&A or similar activities, I probably could have continued like that. But I just felt that it was important to develop a portfolio, to be more imaginative, to challenge myself with a broader range of possibilities. And the final comment I want to make is in terms of, well, two comments. One is reframing failure. I think we need, if you look at some of the most innovative countries in the world, like Israel, if you look at the relationship a lot of the West has with perfectionism and trying not to fail and trying to answer very well known questions, that is not what's going to help complex problems. What we need is to be comfortable with failure, to test, to experiment, to prototype. And the reason why this is so important is because in a complex world, as you know, we're focused more on the unknown unknowns. And therefore, you can't just rely on expertise or on a range of right answers. There are points with unknown unknowns, which is a discovery. And so unless you have a range of right answers, I beg your pardon, unless you have a range of expertise and a range of skills, and you can improvise and emerge with comfort with things that you don't know, nothing will be done. That complex world of unknown unknowns is not the one which helps you get a probe to Mars. It's not what helps you fix a fighter jet. It's not what helps with technical specifications, how a car works or plane works. Those are problems and challenges like climate, like AI, like many aspects of space, like many aspects of health, which we don't have a scientific grasp or understanding of yet. And more of the world is complex. And so that is really the aspect where range is essential, because you can't just rely on given expertise or a set of answers or playbook to follow.
Fantastic. I think that's amazing. So I know your guidebooks just come out, and I really enjoyed reading the chapter on space. It included a little bit of everything. The diversity of themes included space and entertainment, manufacturing, mining, and more. So it was fantastic reading. Could you share with our audience a little bit about the guidebook? Because space was just one chapter of many. I mean, you cover a lot of our ecosystem out there.
Thanks for taking the time to have read it and the interest. Indeed, the guidebook is quite broad. It's actually 4 volumes. It talks about many of the topics we're talking about now. The first volume is really understanding the foundations of change. What is changing? What is not change? What is disruptive? How to think about basically how to make sense of a nonlinear, non-predictable, and complex world. What does that even mean? So that's the foundations. The second volume, we look at really understanding frameworks to help you or your business stay relevant. So these are very concrete, practical frameworks, not only to make sense and understand, but actually to make decisions and to basically stay relevant in this complex 21st century. And then we focus on the third volume, which is really your life, how to beta your life. What should you be thinking about as an individual? So it covers many other topics like education, which I think are essential. And then the fourth volume, which the space chapter you mentioned, is really what does it mean for your business? How to use disruption as a springboard to value creation. And for the anecdote, the way this guidebook arose, which I'm writing with an amazing journalist and futurist called Lydia Zwin, who's originally from Sao Paulo in Brazil and now lives in Sweden. But the way the idea came about is as I started talking about these topics, which we've discussed around unpredictability, uncertainty, as I spent more time on these topics, I started giving talks or being asked to give talks and lectures and things by different organizations and universities. And I kept being asked the question, where can I find a comprehensive guide on all this? And there's some amazing things on every aspect we talk about. The amazing books about space, amazing books around how to become a futurist. But what I felt could be interesting was to really take all these different aspects and try and connect the dots and also answer the so what question. What does this disruption mean to you? What do you do about it? How does it all connect? And so that's why we decided to put this together. But what I would say, just to wrap on this, is that we're not trying to predict the future. We're not looking at disruption just in terms of Silicon Valley or the next product innovation. This is not a kind of formulaic innovation book. It's really quite a fundamental, multifaceted, where we really try and understand the signals and not be submerged by the noise.
Fantastic. So, of course, I have to talk about, we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's speech, "We choose to go to the moon," in September 2022. So do you have any predictions for 2023?
That's a nice one. Well, if I was kind of being strict with the way I think about life and write about, I would sort of say, as a futurist, we don't seek to make predictions. But what I would say to kind of go in the direction of your question is that I think that there are a lot of constants that we take for granted and that we don't appreciate, and which will affect 2023 and beyond. Because I believe that the world is liminal in terms of we don't enter a phase and have a pre-COVID and a post-COVID or what have you. I think the world is more intertwined and intersecting, and those create additional knock-on effects and spillovers, and that will continue. So I'd say, the things you're seeing around technology evolution and AI will not stop. The interconnectedness of the world and geopolitically, with major existential situations emerging overnight, hopefully the world will succumb to them, but not necessarily, will continue, whether it's nuclear, whether it's climate, but as well as the wonders of discovery. When I mentioned earlier everything that can be automated, digitized, it creates wonders as well. If you think about the role of drug discovery, if you think of the speed with which vaccines and diseases can be kind of better understood. So again, it plays with this duality of change, which is, as much positive and opportunities as it is problematic. So my prediction is really that I hope the world will understand that the world is not predictable. And I hope that the systems and the society and humanity will start to be more aligned to that understanding of the world, because the world is not going to, suddenly become predictable, stable, and controllable.
Well, that's fantastic. As you can imagine, Roger, we are almost at our hour. The time went so quickly. It's been so fascinating. I hope you're going to come back and join us. But before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience today?
Well, we covered a lot, and I'm extremely grateful to have had this conversation. I hope there's some important aspects. The most important thing I just want to kind of share with the audience is really around understanding the true nature of our world, and that the systems are not necessarily aligned and prepared for managing this complex world. But we do have the agency to increase the alignment and to improve the resilience and adaptability of the world. It starts with education, but it impacts, of course, decision-making, policy, and many things. But my hope is that, the more, I don't want to kind of sound completely altruistic or unauthentic, but the more we all understand some of the topics we've talked about and the true nature of the world, the better I think we're able to make sense of the world and to become more resilient and to make the world, forgive the cliche, but a better place by virtue of addressing some of the complex systemic challenges and understanding that they exist and that we can think about ways to address them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much, Roger. I'm looking forward to having you back so we can talk more about space, innovation, invention, investment, workforce, disruption, climate change. I could go on and on. So this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure our audience has really enjoyed it too.
It was fantastic. So it's such a pleasure and honor to be with you on the Space Foundation Global Alliance series. Shelli, thanks so much.
Fantastic. Well, to our audience, if you're interested in learning more about our Space Foundation Global Alliance or watching other Global Alliance webinars, go to spacefoundation.org for more content. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again, because there's a place for everyone in the new global space ecosystem.
Thank you.